Today, in our quest for how to write for social media, we're going to take a look at social media as a sharing tool. But to really grasp the social aspect of this tool, we have to take a short excursion into the philosophical, because there's something much deeper here at play than many of us may realize. To really appreciate what's going on here, we have to go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Now, the Greeks had an entirely communal existence. They never really thought of themselves as an individual. In fact, the phrase, "I feel angry," just simply didn't exist. They might say something more like, "Ares has inspired in me a feeling of anger," always deferring to muses or a personal genius, this sort of voice or deity that gave them the feelings that we now attribute to individuals. But this is because within the socio-political context of their society, they had no need for individualism. In fact, they had no word for it. Personal identity was social identity. Pericles is quoted as saying, "We do not say that a man who takes no interest in the politics, that is, the affairs of the polis, is a man who minds his own business. We say he has no business here at all." Every individual pursuit was only seen as important or relevant in light of its contribution to the whole of society. But in the 15th century, there's a shift. The end of feudalism causes the rise of wealthy individuals in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. And this meant that for the first time, people outside of the church and nobility could do things like commission art. The individual could now do things that before were only possible for the state to do. That, in some ways, placed the individual on even cultural footing with the state itself. And we start to see the ego begin to enter in. For example, this image you see here is a personalization of a commissioned triptych. Roger van der Weyden, his nativity scene, shows a strange character that you may not be able to recognize at first glance. Even the most well-versed scholars of biblical literature would have a hard time putting our thumb on who this guy is, because it turns out the character in question is actually the donor himself, who has been painted into the scene on request from this private commission. And this happens all the time around this time, and it was the first time that you could actually observe yourself observing Christ. You could observe yourself contemplating. And this had a weird sort of out-of-body effect on the way that we viewed ourselves as a subject, a thing to be viewed, a thing to be taken into consideration in and of itself. Now, additionally, around this time, in the Renaissance, the printing press, the discovery of the New World, and the focus on the intellectual revolution challenged the idea of the individual being secondary to the polis, to the group. Now, for the first time, you could think for yourself, and an individual human could actually show that reason could discover the truth. The individual could actually come to the truth independent of the polis, independent of the group. And then Galileo comes along with his telescope, and he starts to actually discover and prove that the church might just be wrong about the earth being the center of the universe, and that it's actually all just a matter of perspective. Subjectivity begins to enter in. The idea that everyone has a unique viewpoint, and it's this whole balanced collection of all these viewpoints that makes up our knowledge of reality. And all this amounts to a gradual reprioritization towards the individual, towards the power of the individual, and their capability to seek truth for themselves. And so in the 16th century, we start to see a new value being placed on the individual, on the everyday, on the way things are experienced by real people in real time. This is almost the same way that citizen journalism changed the value we placed on ordinary people and their ability to report. Here's an example of genre painting, a painting called Fishmonger by Adrian van Ostade in 1660 to 1670. And it reflects this shift towards the value of the everyday, the glorifying of everyday work rather than ideal forms. For the first time, you start to be able to see visible brushstrokes because the perfect, the smooth, the clean, the ideal is now just all an illusion. We sort of see it for what it is, but the paint is real, and so it's okay if the paint shows up as paint. This is all part of this pushback against idealism, which is the realm of unity where all things cohere into a sublime and communal oneness. Instead, we see a favor towards realism, this realm of variation and inevitable heteromorphism where we value the difference in individuality. Now, all of this keeps on snowballing and carrying on through the 20th century, all the way into modernism, even into postmodernism, until we reach a crisis point where phenomenologist Martin Heidegger notes that we have a radically changed conception of being and time, distorted by what he calls a crisis of imagination. Now, he talks about being, that is, what it is to experience a state of existence, and time, that we are existent in a given place and in a given context. But he thinks that we suffer from this crisis of imagination in which we equate being with having, and time with immediacy. So to be in time is actually to have with some immediacy. So in that sense, immediately having for ourselves becomes the root of our existential understanding of being in time. In order to be in time, in order to exist in this sense, it necessitates that we put our selfish desire before that of the collective, which is something we had been practicing now since the 15th century, as we just saw. So it all comes to a head here, where we now have to put ourselves first in order to feel like we even exist. And given that modern people are generally more or less distrustful of each other, asserting our individualism is subconsciously a matter of survival, of clawing tooth and nail for our own existence. And so in a weird way, that people are reading our tweets is in some way tied to our very understanding of self and existence, and even eternity, this hubris of the self-actualization of our metaphysical destinies, that somehow if we're being heard and if we're able to have a sense of individualism in the most immediate sense, that we exist a little bit more than we did before. Now, we don't think of these connections consciously, but the many-to-many model taps into a real powerful, deep, primordial urge to be known. And so that's why we're going to discover today it's important to stroke people's primordial urges a bit by engaging through social media. We have to actually assume that other people's egos are just as important and fragile as our own, and actually engage with them to make the most of what this new paradigm of individualistic community has given us. And so now we're going to take a look at how to actually navigate that in a sort of successful way through our writing, and hope that we don't bring down the whole of society in the process.